Chapter 3 of the English Colonies. Section 2, the New England Colonies. We're going to start out this lesson by talking about two different groups of people, both of which were from England and both of which were persecuted by the English. When I say they're persecuted, that means they were attacked for their beliefs. The first group are the Puritans. The Puritans wanted to purify or reform the Anglican Church. Remember, that's the church that was started by King Henry VIII because he wanted to divorce his wife. The Puritans, again, want to reform the church. It wasn't so much that they wanted to leave the Anglican Church, they just wanted to change it, purify it. As you can kind of see in my picture here, it's a political cartoon, so it's not, accurate, but well, I shouldn't say it's not accurate. However, it's kind of funny in the sense that the Puritans wanted to change the church and make it better in their eyes. The Pilgrims are the second group, and they wanted to separate from the Anglican Church. They no longer wanted to be a part of the church. That's why the Pilgrims are sometimes called separatists. The Pilgrims are going to leave England, and they're going to go to a neighboring country called the Netherlands, where they thought they would have more religious freedom. And so they are there in the Netherlands for about 10 years, I'd say. And everything was fine. I mean, they were not persecuted, but they felt, after a while that they were kind of losing their English ways. And so they decided to leave the Netherlands and go to America. Now, the Pilgrims will leave the Netherlands in 1620 on board a ship called the Mayflower. Remember, they're not the ones who came over with Christopher Columbus. Okay, that was 200 years earlier. But they come on the Mayflower, and they were going to Jamestown, the colony that was already established. So on their way across the ocean, they went off course somehow, and they were a little north of their intended objective. They will land or come to the area that we now know as Massachusetts at a place that they will call Plymouth Rock in 1620. Now, because they end up in Massachusetts, not in Jamestown where they originally intended, they didn't have any kind of laws or any kind of thing established to start a new settlement. So all the men on board the Mayflower decided to get together and list some general laws that will eventually be called the Mayflower Compact. And you can see from this picture here, this is the Mayflower Compact. It was a legal contract agreeing to have fair laws for the general good of the colony. That's an important phrase, the general good. Here you can get a closer look at the document of the Mayflower Compact, and you see down here at the bottom, all the men signed the document in 1620. When I say the general good of the colony, it means that some people may not agree with some of the other things that were said in the Mayflower, but they felt like it was good for the entire community, so they would go along with it. The Pilgrims are going to establish their colony in an abandoned Indian village. So there were some things that were already established, but for the most part, they weren't prepared to start from scratch, I should say. They were going to Jamestown where it was already established. So they're having to start all over again, and there were some struggles in that first winter that they were in America. It was cold up there in the north, and having, not a lot of food and such. You have Native Americans who will help out some. One of those Indians was a guy named Squanto. He taught the Pilgrims how to fertilize the soil and to make good homes and what crops would grow well in that particular land. And after a year of successful farming, the Pilgrims will celebrate that first year together with the Native Americans who helped them, and this is where we kind of get the idea of the Thanksgiving celebration. And they did that with the Wampanoag Indians. Going back to the Puritans were known as dissenters. A dissenter is someone who disagrees with the practices or teachings of an organization. So the Puritans were in disagreement with the actions and the opinions of England and the Church of England, or the Anglican Church. So thousands of Puritans will flee England, again because they were persecuted, in something called the Great Migration. The Great Migration happened from 1629 to 1640. And the majority of these Puritans will head over to America. As you can see from our map here, this top line is showing you where a lot of the Puritans went. The thicker lines means a lot more that went in that particular direction. So you can see where a lot of the Puritans ended up in the New England area, more specifically the Massachusetts area, which we just got done talking about. Some of the Puritans also headed toward the Caribbean islands down here in the Caribbean Sea. Many of the Puritans who were heading toward the New England area were led by a man named John Winthrop, and he received a charter to establish a colony in Massachusetts to seek religious freedom for Puritans. And he established something called the Massachusetts Bay Colony. That was the name of that colony in New England. If you're looking at the map, that green area right there is the Massachusetts Bay Colony. Right below it is the Plymouth Colony. Eventually those two will merge together. So what was life like for the colonists in the New England area? The colonists who established the Massachusetts Bay Colony are going to establish a type of government called the General Court. It was a form of a self-government. The government leaders were church members. You can only be a church member. For example, well, you could only be male, you had to be a white person, and you had to be a church-going member, and probably you had to own land. So that eliminated a lot of people from that particular group. But the government leaders were church members, and the dissenters of this particular type of government were forced out of the colony, which is kind of ironic since they were dissenters themselves over in England, and now they're kicking out dissenters from their colony. We're going to go through a list of dissenters. The first one was a guy named Thomas Hooker, and he and his followers didn't like that the restrictions of government in Massachusetts, well, I already said it, they're really strict. He didn't like that. He wanted to have the government more democratic. But of course, because he didn't agree with the government, he was forced out of the Massachusetts Bay Colony, so he will leave and form his own colony called the Colony of Connecticut, which, if you look at the map, it's the purple area right to the south of Massachusetts. And he created the Connecticut colony to make a government that was more democratic. Roger Williams, another Puritan, again did not agree with the teachings of the Puritans in Massachusetts, and he was kicked out, if you will, from Massachusetts, and he will found his own colony called Providence, which eventually will be called Rhode Island. Again, in the map you see the yellow area there. His whole idea of government was a separation of church and state. He did not believe that religion should mix with government. And his principles are in our country today. So if you go to government buildings today, you would not see any sign of religion in them. And that's one of the founding principles of our country. Anne Hutchinson was a Puritan woman who liked to go to church, and she was so interested in what ministers had to say in the teachings of church that she sometimes would hold like Bible studies and such at her home. And oftentimes she questioned the teachings of the religious leaders. And that made the male-dominated society nervous because women weren't supposed to talk about these things in public. But she did. And she oftentimes in church would question the religious leaders. So eventually they put her on trial. And on the stand when she was being grilled, she said that God spoke to her, which just outraged the whole group of religious people in that church, because God surely would not talk to a female. And so for that she was forced out of Massachusetts, and she went down to Rhode Island where Roger Williams was. Eventually she is killed, and her family are killed by Native Americans. This is Anne Hutchinson right here. In the 1690s, the city of Salem, which is in Massachusetts, they held the largest number of witchcraft trials in history. It all started with 3 girls who felt like they were possessed by some women in the town of Salem. And 19 of them were put to death through various means. Sometimes some of them were hanged, others were burned at the stake, and even some cases that have been heard that, to tell if they were a witch or not, they would tie a rock to their feet and throw them into the river, and if they floated, they were a witch. If they sank, they knew they weren't a witch. But it seems like a lose-lose situation all around, because if you floated, you were a witch, you were probably killed anyway. And if you sank to the bottom, you drowned and died. So it was a tough luck for these people. In Massachusetts and the New England colonies, the climate and soil was not really all that great for farming. You might have a little bit of farmland in various places, but overall, there weren't a lot of great farming areas. And mainly if there was a farm, they were small farms, and they were for individuals to grow their own crops. It wasn't for trying to sell at the market or anything like that. What you will see is more merchants who are trading goods locally with colonies and overseas. You will also see the establishments of some leading industries like fishing and shipbuilding. And because there are so many people in the New England area, and they're kind of closely located to each other because there's not a lot of farms, you do see the establishment of schools, community schools, where you would have, if you have more than 50 families in the town, you had a school and a teacher, and you can come to school. That'll be different in some of the other colonies that we talk about later on. Large schools, colleges were established in the New England area. Harvard, we all know Harvard. It was founded in 1636, and the College of William and Mary was founded in 1693. They were really big on higher education. But this was just for the boys, not so much for the girls. The girls basically went, had some education, but they weren't really expected to go any higher than what they already went to. A lot of the boys were urged to move on from the local schools to maybe higher education. That is the end of Section 2.